Good evening, everyone, and hello to all of you at home. Very pleased to be here with you at this very special session. I was very pleased to see my friend Daishin here because last time he was here, he said last session was the last one he was going to be at. And I was so pleased to see him that I allowed myself to give him a hug and whisper to him, I'm really glad that last one wasn't your last session. And he said, this one's my last session. And I thought, that's not a bad attitude. Shouldn't we treat every session as that was the last one, what if tonight was the last night that we had to sit Zazen? And it feels very propitious that we're all here together at this time. Yeah, so I want to begin by talking about a deep koan that Shishin Roshi gave me. And it came out of something seemingly mundane. I wrote him saying, do we need to bring anything except towels? Do we need to bring bed linens or anything? And he wrote me back saying, your bed is made, just lie in it. I thought that's deep, that's kind of a koan. That's kind of like the way our true nature is, right? It's already made, it's already there. All we have to do is relax into it, right? But it's not so easy as that always, but I told him, I wrote him back and said, that's a very Zenish reply you've sent me. I'm going to have to sit with that. So I have been sitting with it. And we'll see where we go with it. I've been struck by the trust in heart mind that we've been chanting. We chanted this morning, and that's such a great text. It just seems to sum just about everything up. And particularly, I was struck today by how it discusses the dualistic mind, because the dualistic mind is something we're all enthralled to, I guess. And yet it's so hard to see. It keeps coming up and tricking us again into thinking the bed's not made, and thinking we've got to make it, we've got to do something. There were a couple of phrases that really stuck out to me today. Remaining in duality, you'll never know of unity. It's one. And especially, all thought objects disappear, the thinking subject drops away. And that's such a great description of what we're doing, or at least aiming to do in Zazen, right? Why do we let go of thoughts? Have we ever really thought that through? It's because thoughts are where the dualistic mind begins. Learning to think is where the dualistic mind begins. So if all thought objects disappear, the thinking subject drops away. That's a description of samadhi, right? One requires the other. The thinking subject requires thought objects or it disappears. So I'd like to examine this a little bit. So first off, this subject-object separation that we all experience, I'm here, the computer's there, this microphone's here, the tea is here, I'm here. I'm subject, this is object, right? It's not inherent, it's self-created. We weren't born with a subject-object separation. And separation arguably is the big problem that we all come to meditation, to Zazen, to solve for ourselves, because we dimly know there's another way, a way to view life in which we're not so separate, in which we're not so isolated, we're not so much at risk, We're not so lonely. We're not so alienated. All the things that come with separation. You ever have the feeling like, I know there's perfection out there. If I could just get through next week, if I could just get through the list, if I could just get through this big push, I'd get there. We all kind of dimly know that that's there. Perhaps because that's what we were born into. We were born into non-duality. Of course, we didn't recognize it as such when we were born into it because we weren't thinking. So it's well known that infants don't see a separation between themselves and their environment, between themselves and their mother, for instance. But they also don't know unity because they haven't known separation. That's the way dualities work. This is the way thought structures work, right? Once we as infants begin to learn words, we begin to break the world into me and Ma. That's usually the first one, right? I'm here, Ma's there. And all of a sudden, I'm here and other things are over there. So I'm here, alone, isolated. Mom's over there, dogs are over there, cats are over there, couches, schools, my brothers, my sisters. Then I learn what my gender is, what my age is, what my parents do, where we live, what language we speak, all these things. And we start to assemble these thoughts, and each, of course, we have to do this. This is how we survive, right? We have to build an individual self. I always say, don't become one with the oncoming traffic. We're always going to need this individual self, right? There was a student at the last session when I was doing Doksan who was having a very unitive experience of reality. And we were talking about, that's another thing that the Heart-Mind Sutra looks at, right? Just because we've got unity, we still don't have the whole thing because we need our individuality, and we were talking about that. I was saying, when you have to go through a audit from the IRS or you get pulled over by a cop, you'll need to pull out your conventional identity. This is my name, this is my social security number, et cetera. And she said, yeah, it's true. I guess if a cop pulls me over, I can't just say, I am the wind, I am the clouds, right? We're going to need that. But in itself, it feels limiting, right? So one way you could talk about it is we learn words and we start to assemble them into ideas and concepts, and the ideas and concepts start to develop into stories about who we are, and the stories become identity. And next thing you know, we've got a separate identity as Sean or Ando or Tanya or Shishin Roshi. We eventually assemble ourselves into who we think we are, and then we start to believe the concepts, and then we lose touch often with our direct experience. Somehow our thought structures begin to seem more real than actual reality. If you've ever driven past a gorgeous sunset while unable to focus on it because you're thinking about something else, then you've experienced this. If you've ever had the sense that the magic is draining out of life, and that the miracle of living is gone, and it's just like slogging from one problem to another. This is what's happened. We've gotten caught up here instead of in our direct experience. So we hear a lot that in Zazen, in Zen practice, we want to experience reality prior to thinking, right? And so in a certain sense, you could say we're recapturing what we had as infants, although infants are not enlightened. We recapture that sense of unity that we somehow dimly remember. But we still don't lose what we have as far as individuation goes. The two things manage to coexist. So in Zazen, when we're letting go of thoughts, it's a big deal because we're trying to see the unbroken nature of true reality, not broken up by thought and concept, not broken up by this and that, up and down, good and evil, light and dark, all the dualities, right? That's the way our thinking mind works. It's really useful for certain things like curing smallpox or building houses, designing things. We need that conceptual mind, but it's not the right tool for the meaning of life or for other really important things, like, for instance, love. My joke is always, when Einstein's wife was upset with him because he left his underwear on the floor, he couldn't say E equals MC squared, darling. It's not going to go over, right? It's that kind of conceptual knowledge isn't going to help him in his relationships, right? When Tanya and I were here for Yugen's transmission ceremony a few years ago, when we were driving home, we not exactly broke down, but what happened is somewhere outside of Pueblo, as it was getting dark, the dust shield or water shield or whatever it is underneath the front of the car, it fell down in front and started scraping the road. And so we pulled over, and we had a lug wrench in the trunk, and I had another box of tools, screwdrivers and wrenches and all sorts of stuff. None of it was helpful because what we needed was a piece of string. We didn't have string or wire to tie up the front of the, what do you call that thing? Dust shield, water, you know what I mean, the shield from underneath. And it was fastened at the back, so we couldn't just take it off. So luckily, some people stopped to help us, and guess what? They had string. So we could say that in trying to understand things like love, relationship, the meaning of life, we need to put aside the lug wrench of thought and grasp the string of direct intuitive knowing, right? So, and the string of direct intuitive knowing, or the string that came from these nice people who stopped, we were able to tie up the front of the dragging dust thing, and we were on our way. So I always say in Sesshin, we have the opportunity to remain in reality, to not leave reality, because we don't have a lot to think about, do we? We find reasons to think anyway, but our schedule is made for us. We know when the meals are. We know when we're in the Zendo. We know what we're doing when. We don't have to think about it. We just follow the schedule, and everything's very stripped down. Somebody was saying that the other night in one of the talks, how stripped down things are, how simplified things are. So we don't really have to think a lot. So we can stay with our direct experience and not get caught in conceptual thought. And yet it's still a struggle, isn't it? Sometimes. Yeah. So, but we have the opportunity to stay with that reality prior to thought, especially when we're in a beautiful environment like this. We just go outdoors and just look at how beautiful it is. And we don't have to think about how beautiful it is. The beauty is a direct intuitive knowing, isn't it? I was talking in the stretching today about the hara and how important the hara is, because the hara is our gut level knowing. It's the hara is actually, our emphasis on it in Zen comes from Taoism. It comes from when Buddhism joined Taoism. Taoism's got a big emphasis on the hara, and Zen picked it up, right? Or the Dantian, as it's called in Chinese. And so Qigong is very built around the hara, and it's known that there are brain-like neurons in that region of the body. And so when we say we had a gut level feeling, a gut level intuition, it's actually pretty literal. We have gut level intuitions. And when we realize something about the nature of our existence, of what it is to be human, or the nature of reality, it doesn't come from up here. It doesn't come from the head. It's never going to come from the head. The head is static. That's just going to get in the way of that direct realization. It comes from the gut and or the heart, which is the other place that has brain-like neurons. So we know this too intuitively. We say our heart told us what to do, right? So we're clearing the way when we do Zazen, when we do Sesshin. We're clearing the way for that intuitive knowing to arise. So that reality, that unbroken sense of reality, where we're not separate from our environment, it never actually went away. It just got covered up by everything we learned. And that, especially in our society that emphasizes so much conceptual thought. After we've been trained in conceptual thought for 20 years or so, pretty hard to get back to that unbroken, direct experience of reality, right? Or it can feel that way. It's not really that hard. Here's an example. There've been, I think I've mentioned this before, but there's been research done with people who, as adults, had congenital cataracts. And because of advances in surgery, they were given the gift of sight later in life. And they could express how it was that they saw the world when all of a sudden they can see and they couldn't see before, right? That's something that we all experienced as infants, but we don't remember it, or we couldn't conceptualize it. We couldn't speak of it. Let's see if you can see things this way, just for a moment. What adults see when they have, or even children above a certain age, when they haven't seen all their life and all of a sudden the bandages come off and they can see. They don't see the world like we see the world. They don't see people over there and me over here. What they see is a flat field of color patches with no depth. Depth is learned, it's not in the eye. Depth is added by the brain, the mind. So this might not seem like a big deal, but it kind of is, because imagine if the sensation of depth that we have was gone. Can you just maybe go to your peripheral vision and see if you can let the world advance? And immediately, if the bandages came off, you'd be able to identify colors. Somebody could point out colors and somebody could point out shapes. And that's the way you would see the world. You would see it like a patchwork quilt, where everything is, guess what, joined at the edges, where everything's joined up at the edges. Now, what if we see the world that way? Can almost imagine it. When I first read about this, it's as though I could see that way for a period of time. It's worth considering. This is so much, to such an extent that some people who gain sight later in life, they always have to close their eyes to ascend or descend a staircase, because the visual just confuses them. They can't read the depth. There's a story of a man who trained himself to know how far away things were by every morning he'd wake up, he'd reach under his bed, he'd take out one of his boots, throw it into the middle of the room, he'd take a step toward, try and pick it up, take another step toward, try and pick it up. It took him months to know what we would know. Any of you could walk over here and put your finger on my nose. But that's not innate, that's learned. That's learned. And in creating over there and over here, we create distance, right? We create separation. It's useful, but something else gets obscured in the process, right? So everything we see is conditioned by the way we see things, the way we've learned to see, as well as by our innate senses. But since we created these separations, we can perhaps uncreate them, right? Is that part of what we're doing when we sit Zazen? If we just try to imagine to ourselves what we would have seen the world like as infants, there would have been no subject-object separation. There would have been no sense of I'm here, I'm this, everything else is everywhere else. If we go back to the vision thing, our color patches, not only do we not see, would we not see separation, but we wouldn't at first know that this black oblong thing is part of me. That's all learned too. In Zazen, if we can just strip everything back to the basics, all phenomena is created equal. Stuff comes in through the sense gates. It's all equal. We're not splitting it up into here, there, part of me, not part of me. Does that make sense? This is all conceptual. Some of it, for instance, that sifting of, oh, look, this is part of me. It's below the surface even of conscious conception. But we've all seen children, we've all seen infants do this, right? They're in their crib and this thing's waving around in front of them. They have no idea it's part of them, right? That's a learned thing, right? We've seen have you ever seen an infant reach for the moon? Because they don't know there's an over there, or they haven't learned yet that there's an over there. So of course there's an over there in one sense, but that's relative. What we're wanting to regain through our practice is that unity that we've lost, isn't it? That non-separation. Isn't the whole problem pretty much separation? We feel separate, we feel isolated, we feel at risk, we feel something's missing, we feel that sense of longing as though there's a hunger that something's missing that we need to fill. This all comes from the sense that we built of separation. So we split up the world into subject and object. Am I making sense? Yeah. So what if we unsplit it? Could we unsplit it? For instance, what if even just now, forget the color patches, we don't have to see things as a patchwork quilt, but we learned that these things, the lines between things, are edges. What if they were lines where we're joined? What if this line is a line where I'm joined to the universe? Are we joined to the universe? Can anybody go ahead, remove yourself from the universe. Anyone? Go ahead, because we're portable. We think we can move around. We're portable. We think we're separate, but we're breathing in the universe. We're eating the universe. We drink the universe. We're touching the universe. Even we jump into the air, we're still touching the air. As Jürgen so wisely said, we poop the universe. It passes through us. We can't get away from the universe, right? We're not really separate, but still we see ourselves that way. Actually, we're fundamentally more unified than separate. We came from the universe. Nobody can avoid going back to the universe. Nobody can stop breathing for 5 minutes, right? So are we more separate or are we more unified? But we tend to feel more separate. Where does that feeling come from? Up here. comes from our head. There seems to be a perceiver, me, perceiving an object, say the carpet. But there's a different way of looking at things that is not so far away. Can anybody find me an object that's separate from perception? Can't find an object that's separate from perception, can we? So how then is perception and the perceiver separate from any object? They go together, right? It's basic Buddhism, dependent co-arising, right? Objects of perception and the perceiver and perception all arise simultaneously. So physicists have been trying for years, scientists in general, try and find objective reality, right? But physics is particularly fascinating because they can't find it. They find that every experiment is influenced by the observer, right? And of course, Shishin Roshi used to be a physicist, so it's his fault. But anyway, we can't locate objective reality, and yet we feel separate from. We feel that subject-object split as though it were real, but we actually can't locate it. Isn't that weird? Isn't that strange? I can't find anything that stands outside of perception, or you could say from consciousness or from mind. So everything we perceive is imbued with consciousness, isn't it? They can't be separated out. One way to image how we see the world is it's projected in a screen up here, right? Personally, I think it's more than the brain. But where are we actually perceiving all these things that seem to be outside? We're perceiving them within our perception, right? It comes from us. Does this make sense? It's not far away. It's not far away. These things are joined at the hip, as they say. So So why are we so convinced that we're separate, we're a separate subject and objects are separate? We can't separate anything from consciousness. Even to call something subject, the subject versus the object is a subjective statement, right? We're imposing that concept upon the world, right? So everything we see is inseparable from mind. Didn't we hear last night about the mind alone school, the mind only school of Buddhism? We can't separate the world from our minds. How do we know it exists independent of our minds? We actually don't. Can't be proved, right? We can't perceive the world objectively separate from our minds. So when I first, as an infant, learned me and mom, and I'm here and mom's over there, well, I had to do that to survive. But really, if we look at it closely, there's no over there, is there? Can you find over there? There's no over there. Over there's happening within our perceptions. I'm pointing to my head, but personally, I think it's bigger than that. There's no place else for it to be except right here. So that sense of separation that we experience between ourselves and others, ourselves and the world, ourselves and our loved ones, ourselves and reality, is it somehow innate, or did we create it? Are we creating it right now? Is there a way to stop creating it? Isn't that what we're doing with this practice? Stop creating that sense of separation. So, of course, that's what the ego is, the sense of separation. And we had to build it up as it's just part of normal human development. But by the time it gets built up and we develop it to a certain point, it starts to feel inadequate, doesn't it? It feels like there's something missing. So I was talking about in a stretching period about the hara. And I really want to bring it up in the stretching period because it's a big part of how we get to this thing that was brought up. Did both of you senseis bring up zazen, doing zazen? Or whose fault was it? Anyway, Yugen, I think, certainly brought up zazen, doing zazen. How do we get to that point where zazen's doing zazen? What does that even exactly mean? There's actually a way that we can practice it. There's a way we can practice it. I just wonder, could I see a show of hands of how many people feel like they can connect with the hara? And, you know, most of you, yeah, we're an experienced group. So let's try something. Can we just for a moment let our attention drop deep into our bodies, deep into our abdomen? And let's notice the relaxation response that comes with the exhale. There's a letting go that happens through the length of the exhale that's progressive. It's a nice feeling, isn't it? Very often at the very end of the exhale, in the turning point just before the inhale begins, there's a moment where everything seems to stop. Now, some people find it elsewhere in the breath, and that's okay, but that's a common place. We've just reached the tail end of the exhale. The inhale's not quite begun yet. And that progressive relaxation of body, mind, and emotions seems like it hits pause for a moment, maybe. Now, it's really easy for us to just skate right by that. But on the other hand, what if we let ourselves just relax into that place. It's a moment of non-doing because one breath has finished, the next one has not yet begun. There's a nice feeling with putting our attention there, with relaxing into that spot. Is it possible for us to just gently, without grasping, encourage that moment to sustain? Encourage the mind not to kickstart again. Just encourage everything to stay still. If you can touch a true moment of stillness, and like I say, it might not be at that point in the breath, it might be elsewhere, especially if your attention's deep in the body and the hara, especially if you notice that there's a pleasantness to putting the mind there, putting our attention there. We might notice that to start thinking again would take effort. To grab the next thought would take effort, but to stay here actually doesn't take effort. We're just in pure awareness, like we were when we were born, before we learned to think. We're just resting in awareness without a whole lot going on inside it. What if we just recognize the pleasure and value of that and choose not to disturb it? I wonder if that's palpable to people. Anyone want to raise their hand? Can you see what I'm pointing to? Yeah. So it's as though we're putting our attention at this point where nothing's happening. So the bed's made. What if we just lie in it, right? It's so easy to skate past that point. But that's my primary practice now for years. I don't always have to look there for it. I sit down, my body and mind know that I'm going to meditate. My mind's doing just what everyone's mind does, which is finishing up the last round of processing. I'm just going to let it do it for a minute or two because there's no sense fighting it. That would take effort. And then a little space will open up somewhere between the thoughts. And if I put my attention there and not grasping, just not going anywhere, that's just a natural entry point into Zazen. You know, it feels to me like, on Star Trek, when they had the tractor beams, they fasten a tractor beam to the ship from the planet or whatever, and it just gets drawn in. There's kind of a tractor beam in the hara, if you can find it, which will, if we can find that effortless quality, that spacious, that moment of space, and allow it to draw us in, it's a way of non-doing. It's a way of Zazen beginning to do Zazen itself. So this efforting, we tend to over-effort. And we tend, of course, to be seduced by the next thing the mind wants to think about, which is sexier than empty space to the mind. You know, the mind thinks it's got more important things to do. Well, what if we just stay with that spaciousness? Maybe I shouldn't say anything else. Maybe we should just go off. Now I'll wreck it by talking a little bit more. I encourage us all to give it a try because there is a way of finding effortlessness in our practice, and that efforting can get in the way. Now, of course, this can be nebulous and we find it and we go away and then we can't find it again, but it's worth practicing. It's worth practicing. So I want to talk a little bit more about that subject-object dichotomy, because it's pretty key to practice. It's a pretty key point of separation. And if we stay with that stillness, we might start to see beyond it. If we grab the next thought, we can be sure we're back in subject-object line again, right? So I asked us to see if we could find an object that's separate from mind or separate from perception, separate from awareness, consciousness, however you want to put it. So the mind-only school would then say everything is mind, because you can't separate mind from the world. It can't be separated. You can't find the point of separation. It seems so obvious that it's separate, but it's also very obvious that it isn't. Isn't that funny? It's just a different angle of looking. It reminds me of, you could also look at the opposite. You could say everything is mind, or you could say, as Bodhidharma's successor said, that there's no such thing as mind, right? You know the story. He's waiting outside for Bodhidharma to take notice, and finally he cuts off his arm, and then Bodhidharma takes notice, good guy that he is, and says, okay, what do you want? And the guy now without the arm, bleeding into the snow, says, my mind, I can't pacify my mind. You know, my mind is not at ease. And Bodhidharma says, bring me your mind and I'll pacify it for you. And he says, I've looked exhaustively and I can't find my mind. I hope he also looks exhaustively for that arm that he left lying in the snow. Maybe he can have it refastened or something. I don't know. But what's he talking about when he says, I look exhaustively for mind and I can't find it? He can't find a container called mind that holds the objects in it, right? So you could say that the world is mind, or you could say that there is no mind, there's just the world. There are versions of saying the same thing. Does that make sense? Yeah. So when there's no mind, there's no separation, right? There's no difference between the world and consciousness. So, but then the thinking mind's going to come in inevitably and try and take hold of any insight we have. And this is something that we need to watch for. Now, I don't know, maybe somebody can tell me. I always quote Dogen as saying, with enlightenment always comes delusion. And I don't know if Dogen's really the one who said it or whether I made it up. But I think it's true, because what happens is we have an insight, a direct insight, perhaps from gut or heart. Oh, everything's one, everything's mind. It's inches away from, I've just realized everything's mind. Everything's happening inside the mind. And then we've created separation again, right? We've created an I that's separate and that had the experience. We've created subject-object again, right? So when we're told not to hold on to specific experiences, and even very exalted ones, that's part of what we're talking about. Because if we try and take hold of it, immediately it's as though it's outside of us, right? We're trying to grasp onto something, right? It's not that experiences aren't transformative or don't have a duration, but we have to watch for that tricky, tricky mind that's going to want to grab it, that's going to want to make the bed instead of just lying in it, right? Want to do something with it. So, in truth, we can't say, if we say that there's no mind, there's only the world, or the whole world is mind. What we're saying is that one way or another, there's no separation between the observer and what's perceived, right? It all runs into itself. One thing runs into the next. They all run into each other. There's no inside, there's no outside. But we're still here. I'm not Ando, and Ando's not me. Susan's not me, and I'm not Susan, and et cetera, right? So we can't reconcile the individual view, which we need when we have that IRS audit, with this universal view. They somehow coexist. And for this reason, we say not to, right? If we say everything's unified, well, what about the fact that I'm not going to walk in front of a train and unify with the train, right? So this not two, which we find again in the Heart Mind Sutra, is pointing to that. And we also heard about Nagarjuna last night, and there's the famous fourfold negation from Nagarjuna that addresses this. We can't say, to put it in Nagarjunerish, the way he'd say it, I can't say that I'm an individual. I can't say I'm not an individual. I can't say I'm both an individual and not an individual. And I can't say I'm neither an individual nor not an individual. There's no way for the mind. It's a way of saying that the mind can't take hold of it no matter which angle it goes at it from, right? There's no logic that can explain that dualistic nature of the way we conceptualize things can't get around reality. So thus, not two is a common way to say what reality is. So I want to just finish by saying a little bit about thought and how to tame thought so it doesn't cause us so much trouble. So sometimes thought gets an entirely bad rap, and it's actually useful in our practice in a certain way. Anyone who's working on koans knows that if we get a complex koan, we're going to think about it some. And then the thought exhausts itself. And then when thought exhausts itself, we might have that intuitive knowing, right? We might have that direct intuitive knowing. We can stumble into that place where there's no subject object, maybe many times in our practice, without recognizing it for what it is. And recognizing it for what it is and the significance of it is actually an important thing. So the way we can use mind is we can use it to take us to the edge of that issue. We can use mind, the thought, is it really true that I can't find a separation between subject and object, that I can't find any object that's not imbued with consciousness? Is it really true? That's a thought structure, right? So we can take that into our sitting and then stop thinking and just look. Because thinking is not going to serve us. It can take us to that edge, but then we have to leave it behind. And then often, if we have a genuine insight, genuine realization, sometimes also wants to express itself in thought. So we might have a direct experience and the thought might come up, that's really true. There is no subject object, but that's where we have to be careful, because that's where the thought will run away into, I've just had the insight that there's no subject object, and then you've created the subject again. So I guess the simple way is to recognize that the bed's made, lie down in it, and not start thinking about it too much, right? Think about it just enough to let it register, or to provoke a deeper examination, and just know that it's going to tend to want to take hold and run away with the whole thing and recreate the ego. So it's something we have to watch for. In closing, it's a little bit like the Humpty Dumpty nursery rhyme, right? The world breaks into pieces because we learn to see it conceptually. And all the king's horses and all the king's men are what we tend to do to try and put Humpty together again. But that's not going to help, right? Because even the nursery rhyme knows that it can't be done that way. What can be done is, prior to thought, prior to trying to put Humpty together again, maybe we can apply our awareness and just look, and maybe Humpty and the world reassembles itself, because it never was broken apart in the first place. Even Humpty Dumpty was never broken apart in the first place. Of course, you have to remember that Humpty is normally pictured as an egg, and that's why we call investigations like this eggshell essentialism. And you see how absurd the thinking mind can become if you let it run away with that. I will close for the evening and leave you to your own investigations.